Alienware thought they could escape my review, but here we are taking a look at their 4K 240Hz OLED, a display many would consider to be an endgame monitor. I wouldn't, but it is very good. Now the question is it good enough, or should you wait to buy one from Gigabyte, MSI, or ASUS? Well, strap in and chub out, because we're about to take a dive deeper than anyone thought possible. So the Alienware AW3225QF, what does 25QF stand for? Who knows? Is a 3840 240Hz 32-inch 16:9 Quantum OLED Gen 3, which yes means it should, at least in theory, have better burn-in resistance, or at least I would hope so, versus the Gen 2 and especially Gen 1 models, display with a 0.03 milliseconds response time. Yes, it does have G-Sync and FreeSync compatibility and an HDR400 True Black rating. And also throw this in there, it does have Dolby Vision, which actually does help a bit with some HDR content. So that is nice to see, and I don't know if this will be present on any other monitors, but I didn't see mention of it. So really cool that we have that there. But what about the stand? Yeah, you get one, it's all right, but I wasn't actually able to rotate mine in a couple of directions, so that was a little bit weird, and it also falls over if you don't have the display on it, so I kind of don't like it actually, and I would recommend throwing this on some sort of an arm, but I'd recommend that for any good display. But in any case, if you want to know about the ports, here it is. The important thing is, yes, it does come with HDMI 2.1 and eARC, but it does not come with DisplayPort 2.1, so that is a bit of a shame. And of course, it is VESA mount compatible, and at a price of $1,199.99, I'm gonna be honest, this is a steal for the quality, at least on paper, that you're gonna be getting, because honestly, I was expecting this to be north of $1,500. So expensive, but definitely well worth it if it performs well. And does it? Well, let's go ahead and take a look. First, starting off with the color. And my first impressions on the color are it is excellent. Quantum OLED with a glossy finish looks absolutely fantastic, as that glossy finish does allow you to get a super crisp and vibrant image out of the display. And Quantum OLED also does not have an extra white subpixel, meaning that you are going to get fantastic colors in both SDR as well as HDR. And in fact, in terms of the calibration here, taking a look, we can see out of the box, they are shooting for a 2.2 gamma curve by default. So I did go ahead and calibrate that to DCI P3 in a 2.2 gamma curve, and as you can see, did tighten it up quite a bit, as the RGB balance was definitely off. So if you do want access to all my calibrations and ICC profiles, not only for this display, but for all of the displays that I review, I will have a link to my Patreon in the description below, which also gets you access to the Discord. And I do highly recommend it for this display, because there's a lot of things that you can tweak, and it does help me out as well. Now, as for sRGB, here you can see I did choose to actually tighten it up on the 2.4 gamma curve, and once again, it was a little bit off there, but after calibration, does look pretty nice. Now, as for HDR, how does it track the EOTF curve? That is incredibly important for its HDR performance, to not have things look wildly off. And as you can see on the HDR400 True Black setting, unfortunately, it is a little bit out of whack, especially as you get to the higher brightness levels. Now, on the HDR 1000 mode, thankfully, it is a lot better, and honestly, wouldn't even require too much calibration. So pretty good stuff there on the 1000, but it could be a little bit better. As you can see, it is over brightening things a little bit in some areas and falling short near the top. But now let's go ahead and move on to the color volume. And here it is actually very good. We can see that in SDR, after calibration, got 100% DCI P3 and nearly 70% BT 2020. And then in HDR, it actually does have a little bit better results with 105 DCI P3 and 71% roughly BT 2020. So great for HDR content there, although of course the saturation and stuff like that is a little bit off on both modes, more so in HDR. But now let's go ahead and move on to the brightness. This is incredibly important for HDR as well. And here we can see that in HDR, the full screen brightness can actually reach up to 266 nits, which makes this so far the brightest OLED full screen that I have ever measured. Very, very impressive stuff there. But what about a 10% window? Also important for the average picture level brightness. And here you can see, unfortunately, it does fall a little bit short of what I would like to see out of monitors in the future. As you can see, it does fall short even of the LG C3, which got 660 nits. This one only got 486 nits in a 10% window. good enough for that True Black 400 certification, but honestly, I'd like to see us moving towards 800 or 1000 nits one day, but it seems like they are playing it a little bit safe here. Now in Battlefield 1, a real game here, it does reach 971 nits after calibration, and I'm sure if I fiddled around with it enough, you could probably reach over 1000, but that's actually pretty good, especially for an OLED that is kind of near the top end of what you'd expect to see out of any OLED technology. Of course, unless you go with the TV, because TVs can get incredibly bright. And of course, you do get a minimum brightness of 0 nits, meaning that your contrast ratio is infinite thanks to that per pixel local dimming of OLED, making it absolutely excellent for HDR in dark areas. But what about the latency? Can you use this for gaming? Well, it's a 240Hz monitor, so I'd certainly hope so, and impressively, this is the fastest 4K display I've ever measured thus far. At 26 milliseconds total system latency, that is actually really good and is far outpacing even some other pretty high refresh rate 4K displays. So really good stuff to see there. But what about the motion performance? And here, once again, OLED absolutely excels. As they stated, well, 0.03 milliseconds response times. Yeah, it does look like they're probably telling the truth here, because that is really fast at 240 Hz. I mean, that is absolutely destroying the mini LED on the far right there at 144 Hz. And honestly, even if you ran that at 240, it would look nowhere near as clear as this. And honestly, even at 120 Hz, it's pretty good. It's only at around 60 Hz where it does start to get pretty blurry. And honestly, OLED can even feel a little bit choppy down there. So I would recommend trying to reach 100 FPS or higher on this display if you are going to be purchasing it. Now, as for the text clarity and subpixel layout, this is not using a traditional RGB subpixel layout. It does have RGB, but it is in a triangle arrangement, which means you are going to be seeing some fringing on the edge of text. I'll try and throw something up right here. As you can see, green seems to be the biggest problem, as that is in a awkward spot, and there will be times where you can see it. It's not a huge deal, but your text clarity will not be as good, and overall clarity of the display entirely just won't be as good as if you had a glossy LCD. It's gonna fall a little bit short, but overall at 4K, it still does look pretty good. Now, as for the finish, it is using a glossy finish, and that does help it look really good. Like I mentioned, you're gonna get better vibrancy, the contrast is gonna look better, and the overall clarity is massively improved by using a glossy finish, as had they chosen to use matte, it would basically mostly ruin a number of aspects about the display. So this was definitely the right choice for a monitor like this, and I hope everybody continues to do so. But it does have one problem, and these specific glossy displays tend to light up magenta when presented with even a small amount of ambient light. So they do handle ambient light very poorly. I would definitely be using these in a light controlled room to some extent. Just don't put light in front of the display. If you want a little bit behind it, that's gonna be okay, but be very careful about how much ambient light you have in your room, or you're gonna have far worse contrast than you would otherwise. So I'd like to see them continue to use glossy displays, but maybe move to something like the new Gorilla Glass, which I believe would be even clearer and also handles ambient light actually pretty well. But what about the viewing angles? And because it's Quantum Dot OLED, absolutely incredible. You get fantastic viewing angles, although I forgot to mention at the beginning, this is a 1700R curved display, so it does have a slight curve to it, which can help with viewing angles a little bit as well, but some people don't like that, some people do. Personally, I don't really care. It's a very slight curve, and I don't think whether you like curves or not, it's gonna make too much of a difference. And in terms of the uniformity, overall it's pretty decent, but there were some measurable differences from corner to corner of the display. So overall, it's looking really good, guys. But does it have any issues? And unfortunately, the answer is yes. Both on an NVIDIA and AMD system with two different displays, I did see some major issues over HDMI at 240 Hz, which resulted in some very strange flickering and other problems. So HDMI is, at this point in time on the current firmware, essentially unusable, which is a little bit unfortunate. Additionally, my screen came very dirty. I had to clean it off with distilled water as well as a microfiber cloth. And by the way, if you do that, please only use distilled water. Turn off the display first, let the heat die down for a little while. Then you're gonna spray a little bit of distilled water on your cloth, wipe it in there. It'll look like it's sticking to the display, but don't freak out. Grab another clean microfiber cloth and really wipe it down until you can no longer see any residue from that distilled water. It might take some time, and I had to apply a little bit more pressure than I was used to, but it did come off. Now, also, the last issue is SDR and HDR modes. Now, HDR in Windows is a disaster, not actually because of the way they handle HDR, but because of their color management system. So if you have HDR enabled, it's gonna look washed out on the desktop. That's because it's using the sRGB color gamut with an sRGB gamma curve, which just generally looks washed out and less vibrant, but it is accurate in HDR. But the problem is, I don't like the sRGB gamma curve. I think it really washes things out. So if you want to use a different gamma curve like 2.2 or 2.4, you're gonna have to swap back into SDR. And if you're in SDR, depending on what you choose, it can actually affect the HDR mode, which I don't like. I think they should be entirely separated. I don't know why that's the case. So if you're in the creator sRGB mode in SDR, it'll actually mess up your HDR mode, at least for me on this model on the current firmware. So there you have it, guys. So what's the conclusion? Should you buy this one or should you wait? And I think that's a tough question because it does have some things about it that are unique that might be a huge selling point for some people. So for example, the curve, 1700R curve, that is technically better to have, but some people really don't like it. So it's really gonna depend on, do you like a curve or not? Are you okay with a small one? That's up to you. Also, the Dolby Vision did actually make some games look a little bit better in HDR. I could tell that it was doing some work there, getting the brightness a little bit higher and a little bit more true to what it should be when games supported it. So that's also a cool feature, but it does have some problems, like I mentioned, that hopefully get ironed out with some firmware. But I am a little bit worried about that SDR and HDR modes, and for that reason, I'm gonna say, yes, I do actually really highly recommend this monitor, and I will have links in the description below, but if you're on the edge and you don't know whether or not you wanna buy this one or another one, you may wanna get subscribed and go ahead and wait for my other reviews before making your final decision, as there may be a display out there which handles SDR and HDR separately a little bit better on the launch firmware, or maybe is even a little bit brighter, that could make you lean a bit more towards that. As although I do think this is a fantastic monitor and 4K 240Hz OLED looks absolutely incredible in games, especially in HDR, I do still feel like, especially in SDR, that OLEDs are still lacking a little bit in brightness. So I'll be interested to see if any other ones get a little bit brighter, and especially if LG is able to get even brighter with their display, even though they do have that white subpixel. Whether you're looking to connect a new console, gaming PC, or just need a fast and reliable HDMI cable to connect over long distances, Rupro has you covered with their certified 8K HDMI 2.1 fiber optic cable, available in sizes of up to 50 feet and can deliver a perfect full 48 gigabits per second connection over distances other cables could only dream of reaching. And with 48 gigabits per second of bandwidth, it can easily drive 8K 60 FPS or 4K 144 FPS 10-bit HDR video through its ultra-thin, flexible, and durable housing, and it even supports ER. So if you're in the market for a cable that can drive a beautiful new TV or monitor, be sure to check out Rupro on Amazon today.